The fabrication hall of the Galactic Military Academy stretched across 3 floors, a massive cathedral of metal and machinery that hummed with barely contained power. Morning light filtered through reinforced windows, casting geometric shadows across rows of industrial equipment that represented the pinnacle of a dozen civilizations' technological achievements. Forges the size of small ships stood ready along the western wall, their cores glowing with controlled fusion heat. Plasma cutters hung from automated arms, waiting to slice through materials harder than diamond. Energy cores sat in charging cradles, pulsing with enough power to level a city block if mishandled. Sophie Grant stood at the entrance and watched chaos unfold. The moment Commander Drex activated the examination timer, 40 students scattered like startled birds. The Krenth cadet, a massive wall of gray chitin and muscle named Torix, thundered toward the largest forge, his footsteps shaking the floor. 2 Vorlax engineers scuttled on their 6 legs toward the exotic materials vault, already chittering arguments about molecular density and heat resistance. A silicate student, its crystalline body catching light and throwing rainbows across the walls, glided with eerie silence toward the molecular assembly station where matter itself could be rearranged atom by atom. Everyone had a plan. Everyone knew exactly what they wanted to build. Plasma blades, gravity hammers, disruptor rifles, molecular whips. The air filled with shouts and the screech of metal on metal as students claimed their territories and began marking out workspace. Sophie didn't move. She stood with her hands in the pockets of her academy jacket, watching her classmates fight over scraps of titanium alloy and arguing about who had reserved which plasma cutter. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple tail, and her brown eyes tracked the movement in the hall with calm assessment. She'd spent 3 weeks planning this moment. She knew exactly what she needed, and none of it was in this room. 48 hours begins now, Commander Drex announced, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The Krenth instructor stood on a raised platform, his 4 arms crossed over his armored chest, vertical pupils sweeping the room. You will craft a weapon worthy of a Galactic Defense Force officer. Any materials within Academy facilities are permitted. Creativity is encouraged. Failure is not tolerated. His gaze found Sophie still standing motionless at the entrance. Cadet Grant, he said, and the room quieted slightly. Do you plan to begin, or are you waiting for the good materials to be taken? Several students laughed. Tyler, a Vorlax who sat behind Sophie in tactical theory, made a chittering sound that passed for amusement among his species. Even some of the human cadets smirked. Sophie Grant had a reputation for being odd. She asked strange questions in class. She read ancient Earth history instead of modern weapons catalogs. She'd once written an entire tactical paper on how primitive humans had hunted animals 10 times their size with nothing but sharpened sticks. Sophie turned and walked toward the exit on the opposite side of the hall. The laughter grew louder. Someone shouted something about her giving up already. Torix the Krenth actually stopped his work at the forge to watch, his mandibles spread wide in what might have been a grin. Cadet Grant, halt. Sophie stopped, 3 steps from the door and turned to face Commander Drex. The instructor had descended from his platform and now stood between her and the exit, his considerable bulk blocking her path. The fabrication hall is behind you, he said, gesturing with one of his 4 arms at the gleaming equipment. The materials vault is open. The forges are hot. Where exactly do you think you're going? The biological sciences wing, sir, Sophie said. Her voice was level, professional, showing none of the nervousness she felt under the stares of 40 classmates and one very confused instructor. I need access to the xenobiology archives and the organic materials laboratory. The hall went completely silent. Commander Drex's ridge plates lifted, a Krenth expression Sophie had learned meant he was trying to process something that made no sense. His mandibles clicked together twice, a sound like stones grinding. Explain your reasoning, cadet. The examination parameters state that any materials within Academy facilities are permitted, sir. I've chosen to work with organic specimens from the xenobiology collection. Sophie kept her hands at her sides, her posture military straight. I'll need clearance to access the restricted samples. More laughter erupted behind her. This time it wasn't just chuckles but full belly laughs from several species. Tyler's chittering grew so loud that he had to brace himself on his workbench. A human cadet named Lucas called out, "She's going to make a weapon out of plants. Or maybe she'll throw lizard bones at the enemy," another voice added. Sophie didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on Commander Drex, waiting. The instructor's vertical pupils narrowed to slits. He studied her face for a long moment, and Sophie wondered if he was looking for signs that this was some kind of joke or perhaps a mental breakdown. She'd heard the rumors about herself. The strange human who didn't fit in. The one who asked too many questions about the old ways. "You understand the parameters of this examination," Drex said slowly. "You are to craft a weapon. Not a biological curiosity. Not a science experiment. A functional weapon capable of being deployed in actual combat scenarios." "Yes, sir. That's exactly what I intend to create." "With organic materials." "Yes, sir." "From the biology department." "The xenobiology department specifically, sir. I need access to the megafauna bone samples." Drex's mandibles clicked again, faster this time. Behind Sophie, the laughter had faded into confused murmurs. Even Torix had stopped working to listen, his massive form leaning against his forge. "Bones?" Drex said flatly. "You want to make a weapon from bones?" "Yes, sir." "While your classmates utilize plasma technology, molecular forging and energy matrices, you plan to work with the skeletal remains of dead animals." "Extinct animals, sir. Specifically, apex predators whose bone structure evolved over millions of years to provide maximum strength with minimum weight. The density and grain structure of certain samples exceed many artificial materials we use today." The murmurs grew louder. Sophie heard Tyler's chittering take on a different tone, less mocking and more confused. Lucas had stopped laughing entirely. Commander Drex stared at her for what felt like an eternity. His forearms uncrossed and recrossed in a different configuration, another Krenth gesture Sophie couldn't quite read. Finally he lifted one arm and tapped commands into his wrist console. "Access granted," he said. "The xenobiology archives are now available to you, as is the organic materials laboratory." He leaned closer, his massive head lowering until his vertical pupils were level with Sophie's eyes. 48 hours, Cadet Grant. The same time limit applies to you as everyone else. When that timer expires, you will present a functional weapon or you will fail this examination and likely wash out of the academy entirely. Sentiment about ancient Earth traditions will not save your grade. "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Drex's mandibles spread slightly. "Because I have seen many creative approaches in my years as an instructor. I have seen brilliant innovations and catastrophic failures. But I have never seen a student voluntarily handicap themselves with primitive materials when advanced technology is freely available." He straightened to his full height. "I suggest you reconsider this choice before you waste valuable time." Sophie met his gaze without flinching. "Respectfully, sir, I don't consider it a waste of time to use materials that kept my species alive for hundreds of thousands of years." For a moment, something that might have been respect flickered across Drex's armored features. Then it was gone, replaced by professional skepticism. "Dismissed, Cadet. Your time is running." Sophie nodded once and turned toward the door. As she walked through it, she heard the fabrication hall erupt behind her. Voices argued about whether she was brilliant or insane. Torix's booming laugh echoed off the walls. Tyler's chittering rose above the noise, probably already spreading the story to anyone who would listen. The door slid shut, cutting off the sound. Sophie walked down the quiet corridor toward the biological sciences wing, her footsteps the only sound. She didn't smile, but something warm settled in her chest. They'd laughed at her great-great-grandmother too, when she proposed using ancient farming techniques on the colony world. Right up until those techniques saved 3 settlements from famine. Sometimes the old ways worked for a reason. She just had to prove it. The biological sciences wing smelled different from the rest of the academy. Where the fabrication hall reeked of hot metal and ozone, this place carried the faint scent of preservation chemicals mixed with something earthy and organic. The corridors curved instead of cutting sharp angles, and the lighting came from bioluminescent strips that gave off a soft blue glow rather than the harsh white floods of the engineering sections. Sophie placed her palm against the scanner outside the xenobiology archives. The system paused for 3 full seconds, probably surprised to see a tactical program student requesting access. Then it chimed approval and the doors whispered open. The archive room stretched back farther than Sophie had expected. Climate-controlled cases lined every wall, stacked 3 high in places, each one containing specimens from worlds she'd only read about in survey reports. Crystallized plant matter from silica. Mineral formations that had once been living coral on Aqueous 7. Preserved insects the size of human hands from the jungle moon of Verdant. And bones. Thousands of them. Sophie walked slowly down the main aisle, her eyes scanning labels. The collection represented centuries of exploration and scientific study. Every case had a small plaque with basic information, but she knew the real data would be in the archive's computer system. She needed specifics. Density measurements, stress tolerances, molecular structure analysis. Looking for something in particular? Sophie spun around to find an older human woman standing in the doorway of a side office. She wore a lab coat over casual clothes, and her gray hair was pulled back in a style that suggested function over fashion. The name badge pinned to her coat read Dr. Cara Wells, department head. "I need bone samples," Sophie said. "The densest ones you have. Preferably from large predators." Dr. Wells stepped fully into the archive room, her expression curious rather than suspicious. "Tactical program?" "Yes, ma'am." "Final examination? Weapons crafting?" When Sophie nodded, Dr. Wells smiled. "Well, that's refreshing. Most tactical students wouldn't be caught dead in here. They think biology is for medical cadets and xenologists." She gestured for Sophie to follow. "Come on. If you want dense bone, I know exactly where to start." They walked past rows of smaller specimens toward the back of the archive where the cases grew larger. Some of them were big enough to hold Sophie herself. Dr. Wells moved with the confidence of someone who'd walked these aisles 10,000 times, not even glancing at the labels. "You're human," Dr. Wells said as they walked. "Earth-born or colony?" "Colony. New Manitoba. But my family kept a lot of the old traditions." "Like what?" "Hunting. Tracking. My grandfather taught me how to process game the way people did before industrial farming. How to use every part of the animal." Sophie ducked under a low-hanging environmental sensor. "I know it sounds primitive." "Primitive," Dr. Wells repeated, then laughed. "Cadet, the techniques that kept humanity alive for 200,000 years aren't primitive. They're proven. There's a difference." She stopped at a case near the back wall. "This is what you want." Inside the case, a single bone segment rested on padded supports. It was roughly the length of Sophie's forearm but easily 3 times as thick, with a surface that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. Even through the transparent shielding, Sophie could see the subtle grain running through the structure, like growth rings in ancient wood but far more complex. "Crenthus prime apex predator," Dr. Wells said, pulling up a data screen on the case's control panel. "Went extinct about 40,000 years ago when the planet's climate shifted during an orbital variation. These creatures ruled their world for 8 million years. No natural predators. No competition. They were the top of the food chain for so long that their biology evolved to near perfection." Sophie leaned closer to the case, studying the bone's surface. She could see tiny structures within the main body of the bone, almost like a honeycomb but far more intricate. "What makes it special?" Dr. Wells tapped the screen, bringing up a molecular diagram. "The density for one thing. This bone is harder than industrial ceramics. But unlike ceramics, it has flexibility built into the structure. See these?" She pointed at the honeycomb patterns. "Microcrystalline matrices integrated with carbon-based organic compounds. When force hits the bone, these structures distribute the impact along the grain instead of letting it concentrate at one point. Like how it splits along the grain but not across it," Sophie said. "Exactly, but engineered by evolution to be thousands of times more efficient." Dr. Wells pulled up another screen showing stress test data. "We've run simulations. This bone could take impacts that would shatter titanium alloys. And because it's organic, it has properties that synthetic materials can't match. It responds to temperature changes. It has natural piezoelectric properties, meaning it generates tiny electrical charges when stressed." Sophie's mind was already racing ahead, seeing possibilities. "Can I have samples?" Dr. Wells studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled. "You know your classmates are all in the fabrication hall right now, playing with plasma cutters and energy cores. Whatever you're planning to build with bone, they're going to laugh at you." "They already are," Sophie said quietly. "Good." Dr. Wells turned to the case's access panel and entered her authorization code. "The best ideas always sound ridiculous at first. Let me pull 3 segments for you. Different sections of the skeleton have different properties. You'll want variety." She paused with her hand over the release mechanism. "But I need to know you understand what you're working with. This isn't plastic or metal. You can't just cut it any direction and expect it to hold. The grain matters. The structure matters. Work against it and you'll get something brittle and useless. Work with it and you'll have something stronger than anything in that fabrication hall." "I understand," Sophie said. "My grandfather taught me the same thing about wood. Every piece has a natural direction. You follow it or you fight it." Dr. Wells nodded and opened the case. She carefully removed 3 bone segments, each from different parts of the preserved skeleton, and placed them on a mobile analysis cart. Come on. I'll set you up in one of the research labs. You'll need proper equipment to see the internal structure before you start cutting. The research lab was smaller than Sophie expected but packed with equipment she recognized from her materials science courses. Electron microscopes, laser measurement tools, structural analysis computers. Dr. Wells placed the bone segments on an examination table and activated the overhead scanner. This will map the entire internal structure, she explained, typing commands into the control console. It'll show you the grain direction, the density variations, weak points, strong points, everything. Should take about 20 minutes per sample. While the machine hummed to life, Dr. Wells pulled up a chair and sat down across from Sophie. Can I ask what you're planning to make? A blade, Sophie said. Something that combines what bone does naturally with modern precision. My ancestors made weapons from bone for thousands of years. Spear points. Knife edges. They brought down animals 10 times their size with bone tools because bone can be shaped to edges sharper than metal. But your ancestors didn't have laser cutters, Dr. Wells pointed out. Exactly. Sophie watched the scanner work, watching as a three-dimensional image of the bone's internal structure built up on the screen layer by layer. They were limited by their tools. I'm not. I can see the exact molecular structure. I can cut with precision they couldn't imagine. I can shape bone in ways that would have taken them months in a few hours. The scan completed on the first segment, and Sophie leaned forward to study the results. The bone's internal architecture was beautiful in its complexity. Thousands of tiny struts and supports, all aligned along specific stress lines, all working together to create something stronger than the sum of its parts. Nature spent 8 million years engineering this, Sophie said softly. All I have to do is not mess it up. Dr. Wells stood and moved to a supply cabinet. She pulled out a case of precision tools and set them on the table beside Sophie. You'll need these. Micrometers for exact measurements. Diamond-tipped scribes for marking cut lines. And this, she held up a small device that looked like a pen, is a structural integrity tester. Press it against the bone and it'll tell you if your cuts are compromising the internal architecture. Thank you, Sophie said, accepting the tools. Don't thank me yet. You've got 46 hours left and you haven't even started cutting. Dr. Wells headed for the door, then paused. But for what it's worth, I think you're onto something. Your classmates are building weapons for the battles they expect to fight. You're building something that'll work in situations they haven't imagined yet. After Dr. Wells left, Sophie spent another hour studying the scans. She made notes on a data pad, sketching rough designs and calculating angles. The bone's grain ran lengthwise in the main segment, perfect for a blade spine. The secondary pieces had cross-grain patterns that would provide lateral strength. She measured and remeasured, checking her calculations 3 times. The blade would be roughly 30 centimeters long, single-edged, with a curve that followed the bone's natural shape rather than fighting against it. The grip would integrate one of the smaller segments, positioned so the cross-grain would resist the twisting forces of combat. Finally, when she was certain of her first cuts, Sophie carefully loaded the largest bone segment into a precision laser cutter she'd borrowed from the engineering annex. The machine was designed for working with exotic alloys, but its settings could be adjusted for organic materials. She put on safety goggles and activated the cutter. The laser came to life with a high-pitched whine. Sophie guided it along the first cut line she'd marked, moving slowly, letting the beam do its work without forcing it. The smell of burning bone filled the small lab, sharp and unpleasant but not unexpected. The cut took 15 minutes. When it was complete, Sophie lifted the piece and examined it under magnification. The edge was clean. The internal structure remained intact. No cracks. No stress fractures. Just a perfect cut following the bone's natural grain. She smiled and reached for the second segment. In the fabrication hall 3 buildings away, her classmates were welding and hammering and arguing over energy outputs. They were building impressive machines full of plasma and power. Sophie was building something that had already proven itself across millions of years of evolutionary pressure. She just had to help it remember what it was meant to be. The laser cutter whined again as she began the second cut. 45 hours to go. Hour 27 found Sophie hunched over a specialized heating unit, watching temperature readings climb with painful slowness. The main blade segment rested in a ceramic cradle inside the unit, gradually absorbing heat in a controlled pattern that would have been impossible for her ancient ancestors to achieve. They had used fire pits and careful timing, relying on experience and intuition to know when bone had been heated enough to reshape without destroying its internal structure. Sophie had computer models and precise thermal sensors. But the principle was exactly the same. "Come on," she muttered, adjusting the heat distribution for the third time. The bone needed to reach exactly 420 degrees Celsius, no higher, no lower. Too cool and the treatment would do nothing. Too hot and the crystalline matrices inside would shatter, turning her blade into expensive garbage. The lab around her had become a disaster zone. Coffee cups competed for space with bone shavings and discarded design sketches. Her datapad showed 37 missed messages from other students, probably asking if she'd given up yet. She'd stopped checking them after the first dozen. The temperature display finally hit the target number. Sophie activated the treatment cycle, watching as the heating unit began a precise pattern of thermal pulses. Eating cool. Eating cool. Each cycle drove out microscopic moisture and encouraged the bone's natural structure to compress and tighten. While the machine worked, Sophie turned her attention to the grip assembly. She'd cut the secondary bone segment into two pieces that would sandwich the blade's tang, creating a handle that felt organic and alive rather than bolted on. But she wasn't just relying on ancient techniques for this part. From a case of borrowed equipment, she extracted a small package of bioreactive sensors. Each one was barely larger than a grain of rice, designed originally for medical prosthetics. They could detect temperature changes, pressure variations, even the subtle electrical signals generated by muscle contractions. Sophie smiled as she studied them. This was where old Met knew. She carefully drilled microscopic holes in the grip segments, using a precision tool that could work at the cellular level. Each hole had to be exact. Too deep and she'd compromise the bone's structure. Too shallow and the sensors wouldn't seat properly. She worked under magnification, her hands steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her shoulders. The first sensor slid into place with a satisfying click. Then the second. Then the third. She embedded 12 in total, positioning them where a hand would naturally grip the weapon. They would respond to body heat, adjusting the bone's surface texture microscopically to improve grip when stress hormones made palms sweat. Talking to yourself now? Sophie jerked upright, nearly dropping the grip piece. Tyler stood in the lab doorway, his 6 legs spread in a stance that suggested he'd been watching for a while. The Vorlax's compound eyes reflected the lab's lights in multiple facets, making his expression impossible to read. "The door was locked," Sophie said. "Dr. Wells let me in. Said you'd been in here for 26 hours straight and might appreciate some food." Tyler skittered forward on his insectoid legs, setting down a wrapped sandwich and a bottle of water on the only clear spot on the workbench. "Also said I should see what you're actually doing before I make any more jokes." Sophie set down the grip piece and picked up the water, suddenly aware of how dry her mouth was. "You came all the way from the fabrication hall to bring me a sandwich?" "I came because Torix bet me 50 credits that you'd already quit and were just hiding in here to avoid the embarrassment." Tyler's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "I took the bet because I figured even if you failed, you're too stubborn to quit." "Thanks. I think." Tyler moved closer to the workbench, his eyes scanning the scattered components. His gaze settled on the main blade segment, now cooling in its cradle after the heat treatment. He went very still. "Is that bone?" he asked quietly. "From a Crenthus prime apex predator. Extinct for 40,000 years. Can I see it?" Sophie hesitated, then carefully lifted the blade from its cradle using padded grips. The heat treatment had darkened the bone slightly, giving it a deep amber color that seemed to glow from within. She held it up to the light. Tyler leaned in close, his compound eyes processing details Sophie couldn't even see. His mandibles clicked rapidly, a sound she'd learned meant he was thinking hard. "The grain structure," he said. "It's not random. No. It follows stress lines that evolved over millions of years. Every part of this bone is aligned to distribute impact force along specific pathways." "Show me." Sophie set the blade on a test stand and retrieved a force measurement device. She positioned it to strike the blade at a perpendicular angle, the kind of impact that would shatter most materials. "Watch the interior." She activated the device. A measured impact hit the blade with enough force to dent steel. The blade didn't crack. Didn't chip. Under the magnification screen, Sophie and Tyler watched as the force rippled through the bone's internal structure, spreading out along thousands of microscopic pathways until it dissipated completely. Tyler's mandibles stopped clicking. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then looked at Sophie. "That shouldn't be possible," he said. "It's been possible for 8 million years. We just forgot to pay attention." Sophie picked up the blade again, running her thumb carefully along the edge she'd been shaping. "My ancestors knew bone could do this. They used it to survive. I'm just applying precision they didn't have. What's the edge sharpness? Sophie pulled up a measurement on her data pad. Molecular level. The bone's crystalline structure lets me create an edge that's effectively one molecule thick at the point of contact. It won't hold that sharpness forever, but for the first several strikes, it'll cut through almost anything. Tyler reached out with one of his forward legs, then pulled back. May I? Sophie handed him the blade. Tyler held it with surprising delicacy, rotating it slowly to catch the light from different angles. His compound eyes processed the blade in ways Sophie couldn't imagine, seeing details and spectrum she couldn't perceive. It's beautiful, he said finally. But beauty doesn't win battles. How does it perform under stress? Want to find out? Sophie led him to a small testing area at the back of the lab. She'd set up a series of targets made from various materials. Ballistic gel. Composite armor plates. Synthetic bone. Even a block of the same titanium alloy Torix was using for his plasma axe. She took the blade back from Tyler and approached the first target, the ballistic gel. It was calibrated to simulate living tissue, designed to show how weapons would perform in actual combat. Sophie raised the blade, tested its weight and balance one more time, then struck. The bone blade sliced through the gel like it wasn't there. The cut was so clean that the gel barely moved, just separated along a line so precise it looked painted on. Tyler's mandibles clicked rapidly. Again. The composite armor. Sophie moved to the armor plate. This was tougher, designed to stop plasma rounds and kinetic projectiles. She adjusted her grip, feeling the bioreactive sensors responding to her hand's heat and pressure. The bone seemed to settle more firmly into her palm, microscopic adjustments in surface texture giving her perfect control. She struck downward with more force this time. The blade bit into the composite armor and sheared through it with a sound like tearing paper. Sophie had to stop the strike deliberately to avoid hitting the floor beneath. She pulled the blade free and examined the edge under magnification. No chips. No cracks. The molecular edge had dulled slightly, but the blade structure remained perfect. The titanium, Tyler said. His voice had lost all trace of mockery. The titanium block was solid, a sample of the same material Torix was forging into his weapon. It was supposed to be nearly indestructible, capable of withstanding temperatures that would vaporize ordinary steel. Sophie positioned herself carefully. This wasn't about force. It was about angle and precision, about working with the bone's grain instead of against it. She struck with a controlled slash, letting the blade's weight and sharpness do the work. The bone bit into the titanium and carved a groove 4 centimeters deep before Sophie stopped the strike. She pulled the blade free and checked the edge again. Still intact. Still functional. The bone had cut titanium. Tyler was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to look at Sophie directly, all of his eyes focused on her face. I mocked you, he said. In the fabrication hall. I laughed and told everyone you were wasting your time with primitive materials. I know. I was wrong. He gestured at the blade with one leg. That weapon is going to surprise a lot of people tomorrow. It's not finished yet. Sophie moved back to the workbench where the grip pieces waited. I still need to assemble everything and do final balance testing. And I want to add one more element. What? Sophie pulled up a design file on her data pad. A small energy cell. Not for power or plasma. Just enough to work with the bone's natural piezoelectric properties. When the blade impacts something hard, it generates tiny electrical charges. I want to capture and amplify those charges, create a feedback loop that actually strengthens the bone's structure during combat instead of degrading it. Tyler stared at the design. You're not rejecting technology at all, are you? No. I'm combining it with something that evolution spent millions of years perfecting. Technology alone can be overcome. Natural engineering alone has limits. But together? Sophie picked up the blade again, feeling its perfect weight. Together they might create something neither could achieve separately. How much time do you have left? Sophie checked the countdown timer on the wall. 21 hours. You need sleep. I need to finish this first. Tyler's mandibles clicked in what Sophie had learned was a Vorlac's sigh. I'll help. Tell me what you need. They worked together through the night. Tyler's multiple limbs and compound eyes proved invaluable for the delicate assembly work, holding components steady while Sophie bonded them with medical-grade adhesives that would be stronger than the bone itself. The energy cell slipped into a cavity in the grip, connected to the bioreactive sensors through microscopic conductive threads. As dawn light began filtering through the lab windows, Sophie held the completed weapon for the first time. The blade caught the light and seemed to glow from within, the heat-treated bone alive with subtle color variations. The grip settled into her hand like it had been grown there, the biosensors already adjusting to her body's signals. She stood and moved through a basic combat form, letting muscle memory guide the blade through strikes and parries. It moved like an extension of her arm. Not heavy like metal. Not fragile like ceramic. Something in between, something that felt organic and right. Tyler watched from the workbench, his compound eyes tracking every movement. When Sophie finally stopped, breathing hard, he clicked his mandibles in approval. "Tomorrow is going to be interesting," he said. Sophie smiled and carefully placed the blade in a padded case. Yes it is." The examination hall was different from the fabrication hall. Larger. Colder. Built specifically for testing weapons under conditions that would destroy ordinary buildings. Reinforced walls lined with impact-absorbing materials stretched up 3 stories to a ceiling fitted with observation galleries where instructors and senior cadets could watch from safety. Testing equipment filled the central floor space, each station designed to push weapons to their breaking points and beyond. Sophie arrived early, carrying her blade in its padded case. She'd managed 3 hours of sleep after finishing the weapon, just enough to stop her hands from shaking. Her academy uniform was crisp and clean, but dark circles shadowed her eyes and her hair had been pulled back in a hasty tail that was already coming loose. Other students were setting up at their assigned stations. Torix had a weapon that looked more like a small vehicle than something meant to be carried. His plasma axe was nearly as tall as Sophie, with glowing energy cores visible through transparent housing in the handle. It hummed with barely contained power, making the air around it shimmer with heat distortion. 2 stations over, a silicate student named Prism was calibrating an energy disruptor that could allegedly punch holes through starship hulls. The weapon was all elegant curves and pulsing light, beautiful in the way that high technology could be when form and function merged perfectly. Lucas, one of the human cadets who'd laughed at Sophie in the fabrication hall, had built what he called a molecular whip. It looked like a simple handle until activated, then a strand of programmed matter extended outward, capable of cutting or binding depending on the user's intent. He kept glancing at Sophie's case with a smirk, probably still expecting her to pull out something ridiculous. Tyler arrived and set up at the station beside Sophie's. His weapon was a multi-configuration energy rifle with 17 different firing modes, each one optimized for a specific combat scenario. It was exactly the kind of thing Vorlak's engineers were famous for, packed with redundant systems and failsafes. "Ready?" he asked quietly, his mandibles clicking with what might have been nervousness. "As I'll ever be," Sophie said. She opened her case and lifted out the blade. In the harsh lighting of the examination hall, the bone weapon looked almost primitive compared to the technological marvels surrounding it. No glowing cores. No energy fields. No moving parts beyond the blade itself. Just shaped bone with a grip that fit human hands, the whole thing colored in shades of amber and cream that came from the heat treatment. Lucas saw it and laughed out loud. "You actually made a knife? That's your final project?" "A knife." Several other students looked over. Some laughed with Lucas. Others just shook their heads in what might have been pity or disbelief. Even Torix glanced away from his plasma axe long enough to stare, his mandibles spreading in a crenth expression of confusion. Sophie said nothing. She simply placed the blade on her testing table and ran through her pre-examination checklist, making sure every sensor and measurement device was calibrated correctly. The doors at the far end of the hall opened and 3 instructors entered. Commander Drex led them, his 4 arms carrying datapads and evaluation rubrics. Behind him came Professor Kane, a human who taught advanced weapons theory, and Instructor Vril, a Vorlax who specialized in combat engineering. "Attention," Drex called out, and the hall fell silent. "You have each had 48 hours to create a weapon worthy of the Galactic Defense Force. Today you will demonstrate that your creations are functional, durable, and combat effective. Each weapon will undergo 4 trials. Cutting power, structural durability, combat simulation, and environmental adaptation." He paused, his vertical pupils sweeping the room. "Failure in any single trial constitutes failure of the examination. Begin setup." The next 20 minutes were controlled chaos as students prepared their weapons for the first trial. Target materials were distributed to each station. Ballistic gel, composite armor, titanium alloy blocks, synthetic bone meant to simulate alien physiology. Each student would demonstrate their weapon's cutting or damaging capability against all 4 materials. Torix went first because his plasma axe was the largest and needed the most space. He activated the weapon and the energy cores flared to life, bathing the nearby area in blue-white light. The axe head, forged from titanium and wrapped in contained plasma, glowed hot enough that Sophie could feel the heat from 3 stations away. Torx swung at the ballistic gel target. The plasma axe passed through it like it didn't exist, superheating and vaporizing the gel in a fraction of a second. The composite armor fared only slightly better, melting and separating under the intense heat. The titanium block actually resisted for a moment before the plasma burned through. The instructors made notes on their datapads. Impressive power. Clear effectiveness. Torx looked pleased as he deactivated his weapon. Prism's energy disruptor was next. Instead of cutting, it fired concentrated energy pulses that disrupted molecular bonds. The targets didn't cut or melt, they simply came apart at the atomic level, turning into clouds of component particles. The effect was unsettling to watch, matter just ceasing to exist as coherent objects. More students demonstrated their weapons. Lucas's molecular whip cut through everything with eerie precision, the programmed matter adjusting its properties in real time to overcome whatever it touched. A Krent student showed off a gravity hammer that crushed targets through localized gravitational manipulation. Then it was Sophie's turn. She stepped up to her testing station with the bone blade in hand. The weapon looked tiny compared to what had come before. No glow. No hum of power. No visible energy fields. Just bone. Commander Drex approached her station, followed by the other 2 instructors. All 3 studied the blade with expressions Sophie couldn't quite read. "Explain your weapon, Cadet Grant," Drex said. "It's a combat blade made from the bone of a Krenthus prime apex predator, sir. The material has been heat-treated and shaped using precision laser cutting. The grip contains bioreactive sensors that adjust texture based on the wielder's grip, and a small energy cell that works with the bone's natural piezoelectric properties to strengthen the structure during impact." Professor Kane leaned closer, examining the blade without touching it. "No plasma edge? No molecular disruption field?" "No, sir. The edge sharpness comes from the bone's crystalline structure. I've shaped it to molecular thinness at the cutting surface." "Proceed with demonstration," Drex said, stepping back. Sophie approached the ballistic gel first. She raised the blade, testing its balance one final time, then struck downward in a controlled cut. The bone sliced through the gel with almost no resistance, leaving a cut so clean that the gel barely showed any disturbance beyond the line of separation. The composite armor was next. Sophie adjusted her angle and struck again. The blade bit deep, cutting halfway through the armor plate before she stopped the strike. She pulled the blade free and examined the edge under the magnification camera that was recording everything. No visible damage to the cutting surface. She moved to the titanium block and repeated the test. The blade carved a deep groove in the metal, producing a sound like a knife on a whetstone but achieving penetration that made several students gasp in surprise. The instructors conferred quietly while Sophie completed the final target. When she stepped back, Commander Drex approached and held out one of his hands. "May I?" Sophie handed him the blade carefully, grip first. Drex took the weapon and his expression changed immediately. His ridge plates lifted in surprise and his mandibles clicked twice, fast and sharp. He shifted his grip, testing the balance, and Sophie saw his eyes widen slightly as the bioreactive sensors adjusted to his body heat and grip pressure. "It's alive," he said quietly. "The sensors respond to the wielder, sir. They adjust grip texture to compensate for stress responses and environmental factors." Drex moved through a basic combat form, the blade moving in his four-handed grip with fluid grace. Despite being designed for human hands, the weapon seemed to adapt to his Krenth physiology. He completed the form and stood still for a moment, just holding the blade and staring at it. "Structural durability trial," he announced, handing the blade back to Sophie. "All weapons will now undergo stress testing." This trial was simpler but more brutal. Each weapon would be subjected to measured impacts, environmental extremes, and sustained stress until either the weapon failed or the testing equipment reached its limits. Torx's plasma axe performed well until the electromagnetic interference test. When the testing chamber filled with EM radiation, the energy cores flickered and died. The weapon went inert, just a heavy piece of metal until the interference cleared. Prism's disruptor failed similarly. Too many delicate electronic components, all vulnerable to disruption. Lucas's molecular whip held up better, the programmed matter being somewhat resistant to interference, but it failed the thermal stress test when extreme cold caused the matter to lose cohesion. Tyler's multi-configuration rifle made it through most tests but ultimately couldn't handle the combination of heat, cold, and impact all applied simultaneously. Something in the switching mechanism jammed and the weapon locked in one configuration, losing 7 of its 17 modes. Sophie's turn came. The blade was placed in a testing frame and subjected to repeated impacts. Hammers struck it from multiple angles. The force meters climbed higher and higher, well past what would shatter ceramic or crack steel. The bone held. Small stress marks appeared on the surface, but the internal structure remained intact, distributing force along the grain exactly as millions of years of evolution had designed it to do. Temperature extremes came next. The blade was frozen to near absolute zero, then heated to temperatures that would melt most metals. The bone contracted and expanded slightly but didn't crack or warp. The biosensors went dormant in extreme cold and reactivated when temperatures normalized. Then came the electromagnetic pulse. The testing chamber filled with EM radiation strong enough to fry unshielded electronics. Every weapon that relied heavily on technology had failed this test or been severely degraded. The energy cell in Sophie's grip went dead instantly, and the biosensors stopped functioning. But the blade itself remained perfectly functional. It was still sharp, still balanced, still capable of cutting and striking. Without power, without sensors, the bone weapon simply reverted to what it had always been at its core, a shaped piece of natural material that needed nothing but a hand to wield it. When Sophie picked it up after the EM test and demonstrated that it still cut cleanly through test materials, Commander Drex's mandibles clicked in what might have been approval. The final trials continued through the afternoon. Combat simulations where students demonstrated tactical use of their weapons. Environmental adaptation where weapons had to perform in various atmospheric conditions. Sophie's blade passed every test, not always with the highest scores, but with consistent functionality that many high-tech weapons couldn't match. As the examination period drew to a close, Sophie stood at her station and carefully cleaned bone dust and test material residue from the blade. Her hands were steady now, exhaustion pushed aside by the quiet satisfaction of knowing the weapon had performed exactly as she'd hoped. Tyler approached, his multi-configuration rifle cradled in his arms like an injured child. 7 modes still work, he said. That counts as partial functionality. You'll pass, Sophie assured him. Yeah, but you did something different. Tyler's compound eyes focused on the bone blade. Everyone else built weapons for ideal conditions. You built something that works no matter what. Sophie smiled and slid the blade back into its case. My ancestors didn't have ideal conditions. They had ice ages and predators in a world that was trying to kill them. So they built tools that worked when everything else failed. Think you'll place first? No, Sophie said honestly. Torix's plasma axe scored higher on raw power. Prism's disruptor showed better efficiency. But that's okay. I didn't build this to win. I built it to prove something. What? That the old ways still have value. That evolution solved problems we're still struggling with. That sometimes looking backward is the best way to move forward. Commander Drex's voice echoed through the hall, calling all students to attention for the final evaluation. Sophie picked up her case and joined the others, standing in a line as the instructors prepared to announce results. Whatever came next, she'd already succeeded in the way that mattered most. She'd honored her ancestors and proved that their wisdom was worth remembering. The bone blade had done everything she'd asked of it. And it had done it better than anyone expected. The 3 instructors stood at the front of the examination hall with datapads in hand, their expressions unreadable as 40 exhausted students waited in silence. Sophie's legs ached from standing so long, and her eyes kept trying to close despite her best efforts. She'd been awake for almost 60 hours straight, running on nothing but coffee and determination for the last 12. Commander Drex stepped forward first, his 4 arms crossed in a formal posture that meant he was about to make an official pronouncement. The hall somehow grew even quieter, students barely breathing as they waited. This examination tested not only your technical skills but your strategic thinking and adaptability, Drex began, his voice carrying easily through the large space. We evaluated 40 weapons across 4 major criteria. Some of you created impressive displays of raw power. Others showed elegant engineering solutions. A few of you demonstrated tactical versatility. He paused, his vertical pupils scanning the assembled students. And one of you reminded us that the most sophisticated answer isn't always the correct one. Sophie felt her heart hammering but kept her expression neutral. She had no idea if that comment was about her or someone else. 3rd place, Drex continued, goes to Cadet Prism for the molecular disruptor. Despite vulnerabilities to electromagnetic interference, the weapon showed exceptional efficiency and innovative use of energy matrices. Prism stepped forward, their crystalline body shimmering with what might have been pride or relief. They accepted a commendation certificate from Professor Kane and returned to the line. Second place goes to Cadet Sophie Grant for the biointegrated combat blade. Sophie's breath caught. Second place. She'd expected to pass, maybe even to place in the top 10, but second place meant her weapon had outperformed nearly everyone. She stepped forward on legs that suddenly felt unsteady. Commander Drex held out the certificate, but he didn't release it immediately when Sophie's fingers closed on it. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I was wrong about you, Cadet. And I was wrong about the value of looking backward." He released the certificate. "Well done." Sophie returned to her place in the line, the certificate trembling slightly in her hands. Around her, students whispered to each other, some in congratulation, others in disbelief that a bone weapon had placed so high. First place, Drex announced, goes to Cadet Torix for the plasma battle axe. Superior power output, effective implementation of fusion technology, and tactical adaptability in close combat scenarios. Torix stepped forward with a rumbling sound that was the Krenth equivalent of pleased satisfaction. His plasma axe had earned the top score through sheer devastating capability. Sophie couldn't argue with that. The weapon could cut through almost anything and had the power reserves to keep doing it for hours. But she also remembered how it had gone completely dead during the electromagnetic pulse test. However, Drex continued after Torix had returned to the line, the evaluation panel has made an additional designation this year. He gestured to Professor Kane, who stepped forward with a different kind of certificate, one with a gold seal that Sophie had never seen before. "Cadet Grant, please step forward again." Sophie moved back to the front, confused but trying not to show it. Professor Kane smiled at her, a warm expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Your weapon has been designated for advanced study," Kane said. "The Academy is authorizing a full research program to explore biointegrated weapon systems based on your work. Additionally, beginning next semester, we will be adding a new elective course to the curriculum, Biological Engineering for Tactical Applications." He handed her the special certificate. "You'll be assisting in teaching it if you're willing." Sophie stared at the certificate, her tired brain struggling to process what she was hearing. A research program. A new course. Teaching while she was still a student herself. "Yes, sir. I'd be honored." "The honor is ours, Cadet. You've opened a door we didn't even know was closed." Kane stepped back and nodded to her. Sophie returned to the line one more time, her mind spinning. She barely heard Drex dismiss the class or registered the other students filing out of the hall. She just stood there, holding two certificates and trying to understand what had just happened. Tyler skittered over on his 6 legs, his mandibles clicking rapidly with excitement. "Did that just happen? Did they just create an entire course because of your weapon?" "I think so," Sophie said faintly. "That's incredible. Nobody's done anything like that in decades. Maybe longer." Tyler's compound eyes focused on her face. "You know what this means, right? You didn't just pass the examination. You changed the entire program." Other students approached, some to congratulate her, others just to get a closer look at the bone blade. Lucas, who'd mocked her so harshly in the fabrication hall, stood back a bit but eventually came forward. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I thought you were wasting your time with primitive materials. I didn't understand what you were actually doing." "You weren't completely wrong," Sophie admitted. "Bone is primitive. But that's not a weakness if you use it correctly. Can I see it? The blade." Sophie opened her case and carefully lifted out the weapon. Lucas leaned in close, studying the grain of the bone and the way light seemed to sink into the heat-treated surface. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "And I mean that as an engineer, not just aesthetically. The elegance of the solution is beautiful." More students gathered around, asking questions about the construction process, the material properties, how she'd thought of combining old and new techniques. Sophie answered as best she could, but her exhaustion was catching up fast and her words were starting to slur. Commander Drex appeared beside the growing crowd. "Cadet Grant needs rest. You can ask your questions during the new elective course next semester." His tone was firm but not unkind. The students dispersed, though many cast final glances back at the bone blade. When they were alone, Drex picked up the weapon himself again, turning it over in his hands with surprising gentleness for someone his size. "I have fought in 17 campaigns across 9 star systems," he said. "I have used weapons so advanced they would seem like magic to pre-spaceflight civilizations. Energy weapons that could level cities. Kinetic accelerators that could punch through starship armor. molecular disassemblers that could unmake matter itself. He looked at Sophie. But I have never held a weapon that felt as honest as this one. Honest, sir? It is exactly what it appears to be. Bone-shaped and refined. No hidden power sources that might fail. No complex systems that require constant maintenance. No dependencies on supply chains or rare materials. He ran one claw carefully along the edge, testing the sharpness. It is a tool that would work just as well 1,000 years from now as it does today. That is honest engineering. He handed the blade back to her. I underestimated you, Cadet Grant. I saw your choice to use bone as primitivism or stubbornness. I did not see it as what it truly was, strategic thinking about what actually matters in combat. Not the most impressive weapon, but the most reliable one. My grandfather taught me that reliability beats performance when your life depends on it, Sophie said. Your grandfather was wise. Drex's ridge plate settled, and what Sophie had learned was a Krenth expression of respect. I hope you will share that wisdom with your future students. We have spent too long chasing advancement and forgotten to ask whether we were advancing toward something meaningful. He left her alone in the examination hall, his heavy footsteps echoing away down the corridor. Sophie stood among the testing equipment and scattered target materials, holding her bone blade and trying to let everything sink in. Second place. A research designation. A new course in the curriculum. Teaching position. She carefully placed the blade back in its case and sealed it, then picked up her certificates and the case together. Her reflection caught in the polished surface of a nearby testing screen. She looked terrible, hair falling out of its tie, dark circles under her eyes, her uniform rumpled from 2 days of continuous work. But she was smiling. Sophie made her way out of the examination hall and through the quiet corridors of the academy. Most students had already returned to their dorms or headed to the dining hall to celebrate or commiserate. The biological sciences wing was ahead, and Sophie found herself walking toward it almost unconsciously. Dr. Wells was still in her office, bent over a microscope despite the late hour. She looked up when Sophie knocked on the open door. Well, the professor asked. Second place. And they're creating a new elective based on my work. Dr. Wells' face split into a wide grin. I knew it. The moment you walked in here asking about bone samples, I knew you were onto something special. She stood and came around her desk. May I see it one more time? Sophie opened the case. Dr. Wells lifted the blade with the careful respect of a scientist who understood exactly what she was holding. You took material that evolution spent 8 million years perfecting and added human innovation to it, Wells said softly. This is what science should be. Not discarding the old in favor of the new, but building bridges between them. That's what I tried to tell them, Sophie said. That looking backward isn't the same as going backward. And you proved it beautifully. Wells handed the blade back. I expect I'll be seeing you again next semester when you're teaching that new course? If I can stay awake that long. Wells laughed. Go get some sleep, cadet. You've earned it. Sophie left the biological sciences wing and headed for her dormitory. The corridors were mostly empty now, lit by soft evening lighting that was easier on tired eyes. She passed a window that looked out over the academy grounds and stopped for a moment. The stars were just becoming visible in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, hidden by distance and the light of closer suns, was Earth. The world her ancestors had conquered with stone and bone and determination. They'd survived ice ages with nothing but fire and cleverness. They'd brought down predators 10 times their size with weapons that seemed laughable compared to modern technology. But they'd survived. And they'd thrived. And eventually they'd reached for the stars. Sophie looked down at the case in her hands. Inside was a weapon that connected her to those ancient humans across hundreds of thousands of years. They'd shaped bone because it worked. She'd shaped bone for the same reason, just with better tools and more precise understanding. The principle remained the same. Use what works. Honor what came before. Build on foundations that have proven themselves across time. She whispered to the blade through the case, knowing it was silly but doing it anyway. Sometimes the most advanced technology is remembering which ancient solutions still work. Then she continued to her dorm, climbed into bed still wearing her uniform, and fell asleep with the case containing her bone blade resting on the desk beside her. Outside, the academy continued its work of training the next generation of officers for the Galactic Defense Force. But something had shifted, something small but significant. A door had opened to ideas that had been forgotten, to wisdom that predated spaceflight and energy weapons and molecular engineering. And it had opened because one human student had remembered that her ancestors hadn't conquered Earth through superior technology. They'd done it through understanding what actually mattered when everything else failed. The bone blade rested in its case, simple and honest and ready to teach that lesson to anyone willing to listen. The old ways and the new ways finally working together. Just as they always should have been.